Okay, let me mention only that there were two papers that were distributed. One is from Raquel Crawford-Smith and Damian Tambini, and I think he will mention also, it's connected with Damian's intervention somehow, but anyways, to have is on the matter, let's say. And also let me mention that Vincenzo Zenozenkovic, that is a professor at the University of Roma Tre, that we had invited because he's an expert and works on this field, and is also, as he wrote to me, as a pluralistic position, let's put it this way, in respect to many others positions, couldn't come, but he sent me a couple of pages as an executive summary of the work he's doing on a definition of pluralism, a critical definition of pluralism, and so we have also given this, you can have a look, and that's Vincenzo Zenozenkovic's position. Okay, we continue with Jean Zilonka and Paolo Mancini that will speak about media democracy in Central and Eastern Europe. I think Jan Zilonka is beginning.
Yes, thank you very much. I was nearly a decade professor in this institution, so I'm always delighted to be back. But today, a few words first about our project and then on the topic. You know, our project is financed by the European Research Council, and it's quite large. It's more than 2 million budget for 4 years, and it deals with similar issues, but from different angles. We are basically interested in the relationship between the media and democracy. And our main concern is we try to understand how deficiencies of democracy pervert the media, so to speak. So what we are really interested in is the qualities of the media and the qualities of democracy. And pluralism here is one among many factors. And we principally look at 10 new member states for Central Eastern Europe, but we have our benchmark states from Western Europe, Italy, Sweden and the UK, representing different models of the media. And the method is largely qualitative. We decided to use quantitative data made by other colleagues, but what we do basically is to through in-depth interviews in all those countries, and the major 3 pillars, we look basically at ownership, then and economic pressures, then politics, particular political parties, and then journalism as a profession. So this is just very short snapshot, so you know more or less how the work we do differs from other work. And the project represents a very uneasy marriage between media scholars and political scientists. We work together with the LSE. You know, in Oxford we don't have media department. I'm from politics, and I'm trying to learn something about the media, and media people hopefully try to learn something about politics. Doesn't go very easily. My major intellectual partner is, in fact, Professor Mancini, who is a media scholar principally, and who is a chair of our academic committee. And I ask him, maybe he wants to add a few words about the project as such, but then to move to pluralism, which is the topic on the agenda here.
About the project, if not reinforce your point that ours is more a qualitative than a quantitative project. What does it mean qualitative? Essentially, we rely on interviews. Interviews with experts, but essentially interviews with politicians, with professionals, with regulators. And then we try to put together with already existing database on pluralism, on the structure of the media, and so on. So what we do is essentially interviewing people, putting interviews within a theoretical framework and combining interviews with already existing data. We are essentially interested in two sides of pluralism. Pluralism of ownership and political and cultural pluralism. Between the two, we work because Jan education, my education too, on political and cultural pluralism, taking into account that most of times pluralism of ownership and political and cultural pluralism don't match each other. They refer to different structures, to different kinds of ownership, and so on. Our departing point is, as I tried to say before, that political and cultural pluralism has to be understood within the specific context within which pluralism has to be measured and judged. And our departing point is that political pluralism is linked, is fostered by the existence of organizations that give life and embody different views of a society. So we link pluralism to the existence of political parties, unions, cultural groups, and other organizations. We distinguish also between internal and external pluralism. And this is something that has to be pointed out, and someone has already said something in connection to this. External pluralism exists when news media are linked to different organized representations. Internal pluralism is something that everybody knows very well, exists when within one single news organization there are different representations of the different voices that compete each other within the society. So we have two, this is the definition that probably, one of the definitions that we have to take into account when we go into the debate on pluralism, that there can be internal but also external pluralism, and that we have to decide if we want to measure external pluralism or internal pluralism. External pluralism is fostered by the existence of different organizations competing in society, so this means that we have to study the structure of this organization, how many political parties, how many unions, the kind of membership, the kind of political parties, the kind of political organization, and of other organizations that we are facing also. Internal pluralism is possible when, of course, media professionals are independent from other powers. And also, internal pluralism may exist if professionals are skilled enough to give fair representation of the different voices that are competing in the society. This is our point of view on pluralism. What we are doing is to check if these conditions can be found in Central Eastern European countries. And maybe that Jan now wants to go on with this. And then maybe I finish with some kind of comparison between the reality of Central Eastern European countries and the Mediterranean countries, and Italy in particular.
So, you know, on the first side, if you look at the Central Eastern Europe, you cannot but conclude that the media there are plural. They are plural. You know, there is a public and private. There are public and private media. There are domestic and foreign owners. There are national and local media. And they express different ideological and political opinions and prejudices. And there is no censorship. There is no monopoly of any single owner. And there is no monopoly of any or hegemony of any single party line. I could stop here. Amen. And yet what our project showed, and all of you who study the region know, that we are constantly talking about media capture in these regions. So how is it so? Why it is so? If it is so good, why is it so bad? And this story is probably familiar to you, and we try to map the details. How it exactly, what are manifestations of various factors. And the first obvious story is that parties in the region treat media as their own property. This particularly applies to public television. And the whole story started actually in Hungary. We can say it ended up with Hungary today. But it started with Prime Minister Antal, who appointed our colleague, Elemer Hankis, as the head of Hungarian television, 1990. And then several weeks after, you know, first independent prime minister, and the first several weeks after, he made a call to the head of television and said, well, can I have an interview or speech tonight? And Hankis said, Prime Minister, I'm very grateful for your suggestions, but this is a public media and you don't own it. And it's, you know, we have to make editorial decisions, and this is how the war on television started in Hungary. And you know, today, because you read frequent reports, Prime Minister Orban has different ways of expressing his feeling towards public media. He does it more through, you know, appointing, as some people joke, for life, but it's for 10 years, you know, a broadcasting board, and he changed many other aspects of media law in the country, plus the constitution. But the pattern is everywhere the same, and you know, you can go from country to country and to see how basically political parties have a tendency to you know, to act as basically owners of public television in particular. The second thing, which is obvious across all this country, is that the property of the media is increasingly concentrated in the hands of a few powerful owners, and they use these media for different. They use media they own for different purposes than disseminations of news. Yeah? And these purposes vary. Sometimes they are economic. They use media to enhance the other branches of empires. Sometimes these are political. They support simply political friends or themselves later, like in Romania, one of the biggest media moguls run, you know, for the office. And sometimes they are mixed. And the problem is that the moguls do not only intervene in private media owned by them, but also they have very direct influence over public media too. I mean, because most of the public service broadcasting in those countries heavily relies on private advertising. And so they have very simple mechanism of influencing it. And the third, equally important, is the journalists in the regions are too weak to resist these political economic pressures. True, the media and journalists often act as predators. They are not always so innocent, they're only victims, yeah? But, and some of them, some of those individuals have considerable political influence. But as a profession, they are disintegrated and lack a strong and clear professional identity. I mean, and there are manifestations of this. Journalistic associations are weak. Legal protection of the work is full of holes. Training is practically non-existent. There are a lot of schools of journalism, but those people go to old to PR. They never get jobs in journalism. And salaries are poor and deteriorating. So some of those things obviously play their role in Western Europe too. But one should here keep in mind what Paolo said, historical context, yeah? Because the rules of the game in these regions are changing very rapidly without any deep-rooted traditions to fall on. Because informal rather than formal politics predominates, and the terms usually scholars use is patrimonialism, particularism, favoritism. And because of economic factors, everybody talks about a Greek crisis today, but you know, Latvia went from plus 14 GDP to minus 10, you know, 25% of drop in the GDP. Greece has a long way to go, not to mention Italy. Yeah? And Hungary had equally dramatic problems after 2008 fall of Lehman Brothers. So what I want to say, all these economic factors affecting Western Europe, to some extent, not in all cases, affect those countries. Poland is good for the time being. It's a good exception here because they still generate growth. So this is a long story in a very sort of concise way, and this is what we basically try to map, how those things manifest themselves in different countries. And as I said, we do it through qualitative methods rather than quantitative methods.
Yeah, to make our presentation a little bit more problematic, even more, let me give you some idea on the problems that we are facing in assessing pluralism in those regions. Jan talked about media capture. How to measure media capture? Content, journalist recruitment, ownership. Now, for instance, if we go back to Peggy's suggestions, ownership. It's a big problem to understand who is the owner of what in those countries. We had a very interesting seminar in Sofia, and there were several, I must say, courageous journalists who came to the seminar, and the problem that emerged was that nobody knows who owns the media. In some way, everybody knows who owns the media, but that is not the official owner. And this is the problem. So how can we assess the plurality of media ownership if there is the most unknown person who is the owner of that television outlet, but then you understand that behind that man there is a strong oligarch and so on. And this is the weakness of indicators that we are using. Even the easiest indicator, which is media ownership, it's a Western, how to say, concept in some way, is a Western measure that very rarely can be applied to transitional democracies, as are these democracies. Recruitment, where journalists come from, particularistic, clientelistic links, or they are recruited on a system of based on universal criteria. Again, we are not able to understand how journalists are recruited. There are no data. And this is a big problem. Of course, again, content analysis probably can be a good indicator to understand if media are biased, even if I don't like the term bias, but nevertheless, to understand what we want to talk about. But it's very hard to carry on content analysis when you face different languages, of course. And there is a problem of sample, because, for instance, you said about 2 main newspapers. Probably 2 main newspapers are not enough to understand how you can judge the plurality of different voices which are represented in the news outlet. So there are Parco, these are problems that we are facing. Mostly, if we want to, I'm a comparativist by extraction, let's say, but if we want to compare media pluralism in different countries, we are facing this kind of, mostly if we try to apply to different political structures criteria which are based on our Western democracy experience. And this is easy because we are facing with a democracy which are in transition, but that are closer to ours. Try to think how this criteria can work when we work on a completely different kind of transitional democracy, East Asia or whatever. In this case, I mean, the application of our criteria at the end becomes very, very weak. But let me go back to, when I'll finish, also the how to assess the legal framework. We can also work on which are the regulatory system that we have in all these countries. What we face, the situation that we have faced, as Jan has said, the volatility of rules. That means, depending also on the different electoral output, you have one law, and then the following year you have a completely opposing different legal framework. And when we deal with transitional democracy, the volatility of the rule of a game is another important big issue that we are facing. So again, the risk is to apply to different kinds of democracy criteria, measures that are based on our Western experience and which don't fit with experience of, with different historical and contextual experience. Maybe I would stop here. I don't know if Jan wants to add something else.
Okay, thank you. I think we'll have also Irina Ulasiuk presentation on the Media for Diversity and Migrant Integration Program, MEDIVA, that is also a program based here, and then we'll have a discussion, and then Damian will speak later, okay?
Second, yes. There is sun, and it's absolutely...
You have it or not?
Just a second. Yeah, let's see.
In fact, in any case, we don't see almost anything, so...
Yeah.
But at least...
Maybe can help her to present.
So did I...
Was there? Yeah.
No, I think that it's really... I closed my presentation.
Right.
So just let me...
You don't see it?
No, I don't see it, and I think that I closed it by mistake. Let me just very quickly, it's a second. It's here anyway. So I think I
Trovato, no, ha trovato.
non si vede nulla.
Così è ancora peggio. Il problema è che il resto è ancora peggio, arriva il sole
But a little bit it does, yeah.
da questa parte, che è meraviglioso.
Sì, e di qua, tutto il pomeriggio ce l'abbiamo di qua.
Ed è fortunato.
Siamo privilegiati. No, potete stare qui.
Are you there?
Yes.
Go to full screen here. No, where is it? No.
I don't see it.
Yes, there, yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay.
The very fact that they were not political was a
Una doccia larghissima, davvero più grande di quella che ho a casa. Davvero.
I would like to present today to you some of the findings of the MEDIVA project. This is a project that is being run at the moment by the Robert Schuman Center and coordinated by Professor Anna Triandafylidou, who unfortunately couldn't come today. It is a project that is co-funded by the European Fund for the Integration of Third Country Nationals, and it is a consortium of 6 European universities, among them the Robert Schuman Center, the coordinator, a university in Poland, UK, Ireland, Greece, Netherlands, and Netherlands. So the project seeks to strengthen the capacity of the media to reflect the increasing diversity of European societies and to foster a better understanding of immigrant integration processes at a time when social cohesion and integration policies are put to the test by an acute economic crisis. To achieve this aim, the project, since the project started in February last year, it is an 18-month project. It is basically getting to its end, and several of the objectives of the project have already been achieved. One of them was we surveyed existing studies, projects which assess the media capacity to reflect diversity and promote migrant integration, and we created a searchable database of these studies that includes over 250 studies and projects from 2000 onwards. So we also created a set of indicators which assess the capacity of the media to reflect diversity and promote integration. On the basis of these indicators, we have conducted pilot studies, and we have assessed 30 selected media outlets, TV channels, newspapers, news websites across Europe. So, and these are some of the objectives that have been achieved by the project. And today I would like to draw your attention, since we have been talking about indicators. So the indicators that have been developed by and a bit tested by the Medeva project. These are indicators that aim at monitoring and evaluating the capacity of a media outlet to reflect migration-related diversity and to promote migrant integration. Such monitoring and assessment can take form of self-evaluation and self-monitoring, for example, by the management of a media outlet, or it can take the form of an institutional monitoring and assessment mechanism. For example, it can be performed by the state or by a media ombudsman or a media professional association. So the themes that and aspects that we monitor through these indicators are the following: the media contact. So this is what and how is presented in the news, media and newsmaking and program production practices, for example, news filters. We monitor also media recruitment, employment practices, for example, provisions for recruiting minority, migrant staff, careers of this staff, and media training practices, for example, on migrant reporting, diversity management, etc. What are the special features of these indicators? They're mostly qualitative in nature, and so we capture different aspects of the question of integration and media routines and practices, but they're expressed in quantitative form as assessments of scoring low, medium, high in a particular issue or field and subfield, which is then translated into scales from 1 to 5. Indicators are designed, we think that this is one of the strong features of these indicators, that they are designed to be used by media outlets based in different countries with different editorial cultures and different media ownership structures, as well as journalism traditions. The indicators are written in simple language and can easily be translated in other languages. They also include clear methodological instructions on media content evaluation that has to be done by the researcher, him or herself, and on the personal or phone interview method, which we use to compile answers and scores for some indicators. Indicators on newsmaking production and program production practices, employment and training. The indicators are also appropriate for different types of media, print, newspapers or electronic TV, but also internet websites. So indicator 1 assesses media content. So here several things are monitored. For example, the first one is positive versus negative representation of migrants. Here we use quantitative assessment. We count percentage of positive or negative in total news, and specifically news on migrants. We take first page, usually if it is a newspaper, news items, and we have also examined, for example, a TV channel or broadcasting of news at peak times, for example, evening news on both TV and radio. So we give guidelines for how we assess what is positive and what is negative. So we consider something as negative in describing or in presenting migrants when we come across instances of attribution of negative characteristics to migrants, for example, through labeling, use of qualifying adjectives, including negative stereotypes which define immigrants as different or inferior, links of migrants with specific negative themes, problems, illegality, threats, explanations given for specific position or acts of immigrants that focus on blaming the immigrants rather than seeking to identify context and underlying causes. and specific negative discourses, for example, focusing on oppression of Muslim women, etc. So what is considered positive? Attribution of positive characteristics or attributes focus on equality of positive differences, link with positive themes, explanations which focus on structural causes and circumstances of migration-related topics rather than characteristics of immigrants themselves. Specific positive discourses, for example, discourses against discrimination and racism, etc. We also measure here active versus passive representation of migrants in the news. And here again it's quantitative and assessment. We take the percentage of active versus passive in news on migrants. So we have three categories here, and we think that the highest score will be when when immigrants themselves are presented as doing positive things, good things. So something medium will be if migrants are presented passively, having good or bad things done to them, and active immigrants doing bad things, so is definitely a very negative characteristic. So immigrant views or concerns, the way they are represented or not represented in mainstream news and issues. Here we calculate the percentage in total news items where migrants are presented. So we think that it will be high if it is above the percentage of migrants in total population, medium if it is approximately equal to the percentage of migrants in total population, and low if it is below this percentage. So we also see whether the migrant voices are actually present in migrant-specific news, because it's no surprise that very often we come across news stories which talk about migrants, but we never have an interview or an opinion of a migrant represented. So indicators 2 and 4 are indicators that are filled by individual researchers on the basis of the circulated questionnaire template. We have the guidelines on what to record through a person-to-person or a phone interview with people who are responsible in the selected media outlet. Some indicators may be skipped. We have taken into account that, for example, one of the countries of our interest is Poland, and there the migrant population is lower than 4% of the total resident population, and that's why some of the questions will not be applicable. Indicators 2-4 dealing with newsmaking practices, recruitment and training. In assessing this characteristic, the researcher has to give them an evaluation of the 3 offered and has to note down in 520 lines why he or she gave them that score. For example, indicator 2, dealing on media newsmaking program production practices, deals with several aspects. It examines whether a media outlet has specialized sections, programs on news from migrants' countries of origin. If there are such programs or sections, what place they occupy. For example, are they broadcast at prime time zone, or are they on a visible page of the newspaper or not? And it is used, these indicators are used only to evaluate media in countries where migrants are above 4%. Then we also look whether there are programs or there are articles in the languages of the main migrant groups in the country, and whether there are journalists who specialized in migrant and migrant-related issues. We also have checked what sources of information are resorted to when reporting on migrants, whether it is only traditional news agencies or it is also migrant associations, civil society organizations, etc. So we have also included questions on who actually chooses what the migration-related news will be published. Is it always the editor-in-chief, or can the journalist approach him and actually propose something interesting on the topic? And does the newspaper or web news site have an open comments section where a person can actually write his reaction to the published articles or a program? And if they have, are they edited for racist language? So we also have asked different media outlets whether they have ethical reporting guidelines with regard to vulnerable groups and specifically with regard to immigrants and minorities. So we think that they are doing quite well if they answer yes, and of course if there are no such guidelines, so it's not a very good indicator. So with regard to recruitment and deployment practices, we have studied whether different media outlets apply measures that are aimed at ensuring that the companies, their media outlet staff reflect the ethnic composition of the migrant population. We have also asked them about the discrimination in the recruitment of migrants as media professionals, and also whether there exist anti-discrimination measures which aim at preventing discrimination in the recruitment practices of the specific outlet. We have also analyzed, we have included a question on the existence of outreach schemes that involve mentoring or supporting journalists from with immigrant background. With regard to recruitment and deployment practices, we thought that it may be interesting to also analyze whether there exists monitoring and evaluation of the implementation of non-discrimination schemes by the company themselves. By the company itself. And we have asked different outlets about the existence of special diversity departments in the media. We have, with regard to training practices, we have several sub-indicators. For example, that enable us to assess whether a media outlet is doing anything in order to promote migrant integration or not. We have asked questions about the existence of courses that aim at raising the awareness of media professionals on diversity and how it is reported. So, and also whether these courses are obligatory for attendance or not. So whether these migrant or minority representative or experts are involved in the design of such diversity training or not. So also monitoring and reporting systems, how they're functioning, and whether diversity goals are included in human resources training policies for all levels of staff. So how we calculate the score for each indicator. So we tick answers on the sub-questions and give scores on specific questions. Then we calculate the total score for each indicator. We provide a short explanation under the indicator about the score, and the total score for each indicator is the average basically score. The results are presented for each media outlet separately, and the results are presented in an assessment sheet for each specific media. We first present results on indicators on newsmaking practices, recruitment, and training, and then we present indicators, results on indicator 1, which are presented on purpose last, in order to contextualize that we have done is an indicative assessment of the content representation of migrants in this outlet for the scope of the pilot, rather than a more long-term comprehensive study. In other words, we put the emphasis on what is done and should be done to promote newsmaking, employment and recruitment and training practices that are conducive to reflecting diversity and promoting migrant integration, rather than just a standalone study on how the given media outlet represents migrants and migrant-related issues. So we have, just a second, I will show you how in practice that looks. So we have these indicators which are publicly available on the website, and since we would like to first discuss the results on national level with the journalists in this country, we will place them gradually as soon as these results are discussed. For example, we had the pilot study done in Greece, and we had already a national event during which we have presented these results, and on our website we can see the evaluation sheet for all the media outlets that have been analyzed. For example, it looks So that's, there is nothing, it's impossible to say. So we have a very detailed analysis and also for all the indicators with the explanation. And I think the questions are really simple and enable a media outlet to also to self-evaluate the way it is doing with regard to these practices. So this, all the information, we have also our indicators that are online, they're publicly available and can be consulted. So I think that is it. Yes.
Thank you, Irina. I think we have about 10 minutes for discussion. Let me say that we had two different presentations. One stressing both the political, the direct link between media pluralism and political structure, and also warning about the difference between structural situation between Western and transitional democratic countries, and so how this difference should be dealt with also in designing indicators, in thinking to the problem at the start, in theorizing it in a way. While I find it very interesting this medieval experiment, because it's showing us that how to face a single issue, very important, but a single issue that is not totally different from what was done before on the regulators, independence of regulators, showing us that probably there are ways in which we could probably think to put single issues at the study and then maybe study the way to link them. That could be something that, however, it's open for discussion, obviously.
I would like to raise a question to the first presenters, Professor Zielonka and Professor Mancini. So you said we did more like a qualitative analysis of certain criteria that are important in transition countries. But if I would invite you to try to translate that into indicators, could they look like, if you would have to think about risks, because the tool, the monitor that we developed had to be risk-based, so we had to think of threats, risks, and indicators to assess that. So given your experience with these transition countries, if you would say there's a risk on excessive politicization of media ownership and control, and you try to assess that risk by looking at public access to data about political affiliation of media owners, and you measure that through transparency tests, and then if there is data on the political affiliation of the media owner, then you're in the green zone. If it's disclosed based on investigation of journalists and media activists, it's like medium risk, and if it's totally hidden, it's a high risk. Or you could think of other indicators like the proportion of specific political affiliation of the media owners across the media market in terms of audience share, etc., etc. You mentioned working conditions for journalists, so could you then translate that perhaps in an indicator that looks at laws or self-regulatory instruments that grant social protection for journalists in case of change of ownership, for instance? About transparency, an indicator that looks at regulatory safeguards for transparency about ownership towards the public on the one hand, towards regulators on the other hand. So do you really think it's impossible to do what you did, but more in like a, if I may phrase it that way, quantitative, or the type of indicators that we try to come up with? Because I have the feeling that maybe I didn't have enough time to outline all the indicators that we included, but what I would like to stress is that there was many of the team members came from Central and Eastern Europe, and it would perhaps not be, or I would like to defend them in the sense that we really took into account their expertise with transition countries, people from Central European University, people like Beata Klimkiewicz from Poland, Brankica Petkovic from Slovenia, Sandra Hrvatin, Miklos Šukoš. I truly believe that perhaps not enough, but we did take into account experience from those countries, and I don't believe that the tool that I presented today is a Western tool, because that's, I mean, from the start it was clear that it had to be something that could be applied in the north, in the east, in the south, in the west, and I would really like your advice on how we could improve this even further, in the light of your experience or the analysis that you did. But it's certainly not something that we overlooked. And when we offer guidelines for interpretation, we try to develop like country profiles, and profile 4 is like is countries with or without constitutional separation between political and media power, or without tradition of political parallelism and media with distinct political orientation. And referring to your book on the 3 models, we provided guidelines on how to interpret the results of certain indicators in the light of the political culture in specific countries. But still, if you have suggestions on how to go further, then I'm thrilled to hear more about that.
We don't have time for it. We do it when, you know, but you know, we do it informally maybe during this conference where there will be other opportunities. But the short story is this. What you do, to use nice word, is a beauty contest. We are interested in process tracing, yeah? Mm-hmm. It's a totally different exercise.
So the type of analysis is different.
So we do not attempt to do what you do. Partly because we, for instance, were already critical of freedom ranks ranking, you know, which exactly does the beauty context, or to show villains and you know, if it would be only who is the most beautiful, it would be still fine. But all these rankings try also to show who is the most ugly. And here there is a problem, because not just political, it's simply because in order to what we said earlier, in order to arrive into judgment, you need to have a criteria of and benchmarking. You know? And for this you need a theory. And here there's no one common agreement on this. Why size would be more important than culture? Explain this to me. There's no theoretical way you can do this. No? So this is a totally different exercise, and one would have to defend both of them, because both of them have strengths and weaknesses on their own grounds. So that's it.
So I'm not saying size is more important than culture, because we did initially look at ways. Can we find ways to link certain indicators to the country profile, also in terms of political culture? We studied that in the beginning, but we just didn't find a solution. While it's pretty easy to include in the tool, like this buttons, a large, small country, that's pretty easy to do, and you could clearly link that to certain border values related for certain indicators. But we didn't find a solution on how to develop profiles on culture, political culture, and what impact that would have on the type of indicators you would have to measure and the border values. That's where we got stuck. So that's where I would perhaps like to learn more from your experience.
You know, Peggy, I have your book here on my computer, so it's something that we are working with. Where we see problem is, as I said at the beginning, I understand your mission, but the problem is, as we were discussing with Gambar before, with the idea of risk, and to try at the end to arrive green, red, and yellow. Probably we cannot arrive. We try to make this arrival more problematic, because I don't believe that it's possible to see that if you find those conditions in that very specific way, the result will be that. Probably the reality that we are facing is much more complex and does not allow us to arrive to a very clear and very definitive definition in some way. This is the problem that we have. So I like your, I mean, if you find, but I'm not so sure that as we are facing a reality, which is a reality of politics, a reality of social life, that we can put everything within very precise and quantitative indicators. This is the problem that we are...
I'll give you an example. Hungary, new law on the media. Orban introduces 10 years tenure for people on the board, right?
9.
Or 9 years tenure. There's enormous row
Yeah.
in Hungary about this, because what the opposition says, he of course wants to appoint his people for life. But if you would be legal theorist, you will tell you the longer term of independent body, the more independence they have. Eh? So who is right? How you code this 9 periods? A red, green, or yellow? Eh? Just one example, right?
Yeah. I sometimes think that we maybe should look at these various studies differently. I believe that MDM, the Media Pluralism Monitor, and also the indirect study for which I can speak, is more intended to use a more structured approach to find out about attention points where to look deeper. And that's actually, it's not the result that is then, you know, dished out after applying the indicators, but it is more that, that there is a way to say something looks awkward, something is odd here, and then we have to start using much more the approaches that you are deploying and put that all together in order to come up then with a sound theory why a country is as it is. So in a way, this is not the end to have these tools. They are just helping to find out first where basically we see possibly a problem. Yeah? My idea how to put the things together and make them actually reinforcing each other instead of yeah.
Well, I think we should let me say that only ask a question. Medieval studies is on the net and can be exactly seen. I haven't understood if you are not the results of if there is something that can be read or not in your work. Can you tell us this? Do you have on the website somewhere already results? I don't. Yeah. It's the information.
Yeah.
On our website of field work. Plus, we do a lot of publications. We just are completing a special issue of Present Politics journal on exactly focusing on those countries. But the exercise is different. This is like comparing not just the oranges with apples. It's just comparing stones to monkeys. So it's a totally different exercise. And as I said, they all have the weaknesses and advantages.
Probably the end of this debate could be that we have to mix the... Sorry. The end of this debate...
Sorry, this is very important because we are recording and streaming. If you don't press this, then you are not there.
That we have to mix together the two different approaches. That they are not struggling each other. But that... we have to take into account quantitative data, but also some sort of integrate with a qualitative observation. That, of course, make, at the end, the quantitative results more problematic. But I think that this is the role of a scholarly community. Because, of course, I understand the Commission asking, is that good or bad? Is that, I mean, this is their job. I mean...
they want to be objective.
Yeah, absolutely. But probably, except her, maybe. The goal of people around this table is, yes, this can be done, but...
Thank you. If there are no other questions, we stop here on this part, and then the discussion will continue, and we'll give the floor to Damian Tambini of the London School of Economics with another subject, mapping digital media.
Thank you very much. Yep. Thanks. We're running late. I'm aware that I am standing between you and food and wine. It's also very hot. So I'll try and be brief, and I'm also going to throw some rocks. But you'll be glad to know I'm going to resolve all of the problems that we've just been talking about between Peggy and our other colleagues. And I'm going to do it, to add to the problem. It's not only it's hot, I'm wearing multiple hats here. I am speaking on behalf of the Mapping Digital Media project. I'm an editorial commissioner responsible for designing the methodology and editing chapters and so forth. And I'm also the co-author of a paper which is in your pack with Rachel Crawford-Smith. And I have to say as well, after the week I've had, there's a third hat as well, which I'm a citizen. You may have noticed that in the UK this week, the crisis got a lot worse. And without exaggerating, we begin to see how, even in the UK, and I say that with some irony, even in the UK, the fundamental problem of what we call media pluralism has been responsible for a huge crisis of democratic legitimacy now and deep corruption of the political system. And we have to acknowledge that, and it makes all the more important what we're doing here. I'm going to do broadly, if I have time, three things. I'm going to do what I was asked to do, which is engage with the conceptual issues and think about the concept of media pluralism, asking a fundamental question: what does it add? It seems to be a proxy for a lot of things: ownership, content diversity, number of other kind of objectives. Is it motherhood and apple pie? Is it just a kind of a desideratum? Just all the things that we would like the media system to be? Is it a concept that adds much as a policy objective and as a legal principle? And what can we do about it conceptually? And then I'm going to rush through some slides about the media democracy, the media mapping project, which does not really use the concept of media pluralism. We talk about media ownership, we talk about market entry, we really don't use the concept of media pluralism. And then I'm going to touch on some of the issues that Rachel and I raise, which are really UK-specific issues, about issues of really regulatory design. And for us, it's a question about how to change the UK media mergers system in the light of the mess we're in. So not much then. Just as a preliminary, the conceptual things. Very interesting exchange here. And I think it's would be really helpful if we want to talk about the value of the concept of pluralism to distinguish between a concept as a, if you like, a campaign slogan, and also on another level, a policy objective. A third level, a legal principle or a right or a rule. And finally, a monitoring tool or an analytical concept. I think if you ask the question, is the concept useful on all of those levels, as a campaign tool, as a policy objective, as a legal principle, and as a monitoring tool or an analytical concept, you come back with a different answer. And I think in the conversation we've been having today and in the exchange between Peggy, who I think is ultimately working within a regulatory or a policy environment, I have to say, and the alternative Mancini position of a critical scholar, I think, are partly based on the differences. I think this framework, by the way, is also useful for talking about media freedom as well, I think, but that's probably for another day. So as a campaign slogan, I don't think media pluralism is much of a rallying cry, frankly. But one of the things that Rachel and I did was look at the history of the emergence of the principle of media pluralism in UK media policy. How have we ended up with a principle which seems to be a proxy for these other things? What does it add? Why do we have this concept of media pluralism? And I think that the answer really is because we combine internal and external pluralism, and somehow they seem to be as interrelated. In the German legal tradition as well, if you have more internal pluralism, content rules, impartiality rules, you may be more tolerant of less external pluralism, structural concentration in the market. So one of the reasons we have this policy objective, which seems to be combining all of these various objectives, is because it combines those two fundamental ones. But I think you also see, if you look historically, and I'm sure if you looked in other countries, that as a policy objective, media pluralism is often very unclear. It's a composite. People mean different things. They talk about ownership concentration, they talk about content diversity, and a number of different things. And that is a problem when it comes to translating it into a rule. The fundamental problem with media pluralism as a rule or a legal principle is what we want is justiciability, certainty, objectivity, robustness from challenge. But I think if you look at the recent history of regulation for media pluralism, what you see is constant challenge, a lack of objective measures. Think about the Prometheus decision in the US. Think about the implementation of the public interest test for media mergers in the UK, the recent Sky News Corporation reports. What you don't get is clarity, objectivity, and justiciability if your policy objective and your rule is based on a definition of media pluralism. On the other hand, of course, if you leave it up to judgment, questions of mergers, etc., you only compound the problems of media power and capture that we've all been transfixed by in the UK. So, trade-off between justiciability and accountability. And then media pluralism as if you like, a monitoring tool or an analytical concept. A lot of these problems are the same. I mean, I think behind a lot of the conversation today has been the question, is it possible to come up with some objective standards, common measures, common methodologies, which will enable you to provide a common conceptual framework to do studies in different countries? And the Mancini position is the case is coherent. The case is you need to look at the context. Every political system, every cultural system is different and needs to be looked at in terms of the context. I think a lot of skepticism, if I'm right, about whether you can provide that common method and common conceptual framework for comparison. Fundamental difference, and quite an important one, I think, really for the policy environment as well. So on the conceptual side, linking all of these things, obviously, question of whether you can provide an adequate evidence base for regulation. But my concern is whether these are objective, whether you can come up with objective measures. I think we've been trying at the policy level, people have been trying for many years to do that. There seems to be a kind of a conceptual strain. We bundle a lot of things under the title media pluralism, and I'm not convinced that the concept is coherent as a result. And I do have this overriding concern that media pluralism is actually a kind of a general normative desideratum in disguise. It's all the things we want our media system to be. Migrants, diversity of content, less concentrated ownership. Could we do without the concept entirely? Sorry to our hosts. But is media pluralism a distraction or a smokescreen? Would we be better off without it? What does it add? Anyway, that's my provocative question for the day. The Mapping Digital Media project is a explicitly normative project which engages. It's a study. I'll go through. It's a study of we're hoping to get 60 countries. The dark ones on this map, you can't see it. Let's move on. You can't even see the names. But we've published already almost a third of the country reports, focusing on a limited number of developed countries, including the UK, Italy, Germany, US, but also focusing on transitional and post-authoritarian countries. And it's explicitly normative. I'd call it a pseudo-academic or a policy project as much as an attempt to bring a common analytical framework to them. And what we've done is provide country authors with a common template, accepting that because of methodological problems of measurement, audience data, and so forth, it's very difficult to make any kind of systematic comparison at any depth in this range of countries. What we can do is provide a common template and a set of objectives. And the objective of the Open Society Foundation is to not so much to provide a detailed map of how these different countries are approaching the digital transition, but provide them with tools, common experiences, comparison points in other countries, which will enable civil society and academics in those countries to engage with some of the political and policy possibilities which emerge during the digital transition for improving market entry, for loosening the control of incumbents in relation to the digital dividend allocation after digital switchover, for generally opening up markets to market entry. So the objective of what we would call media pluralism is there, we just don't use the word. What we do ask all of our country editors to look at are a number of chapter titles. I'll read them because you can't read them yourself. Media consumption, public media, broader role of digital media in society, digital media and journalism, new technology, business models, and the policy and legal framework. We give them a detailed research template, which you can see in the country reports. But the crucial thing here is that we don't impose a detailed conceptual framework, a common conceptual framework for all of those countries, because the policy objectives and the objectives that we would call media pluralism, we think are sufficiently different in each country, and the contextual factors are so different that we see each case as a integral unit. So what are we finding? This is just to repeat the point I made earlier, really, that the key issues, if you unpack media pluralism, relate to ownership, independence of regulatory agencies, the internal pluralism regulatory framework, so broadcasting, content regulation, and openness to market entry. We also come up with a number of indicators, just basic structural indicators about consumption and what is happening during the digital transition. So just to give you some headlines before I come back to some of these conceptual issues. Some of the things that we're finding relate to comparing, using our common template, during this digital transition that we're looking at, who has lost audience? Is it the public stroke state media? Yes, in some countries, Romania, Morocco, Thailand, Sweden, and Bosnia, that's the case. But in other countries, it's the private broadcasters that have lost audience, Lithuania, Macedonia. And a larger group of countries, there's been no change during the digital transition between the balance of public or state broadcasting and private. So, and finally, in a fourth group of countries, both private and public broadcasters have undergone significant losses of audience. So, I will, partly because the slides really are not working, I'm not going to go into a lot of other things that we've done in terms of presenting findings. You know, we also ask people what are the sensitive issues which are not broadcast. This is more of an expert panel type approach. We're asking experts in each country to come up with answers and make judgments. There's subjectivity there. Other experts would come up with another list, so it's imperfect. But we can identify issues which are taboo or difficult to be presented in media content. And we can weigh those and see how they vary among countries. We can look at the threats and opportunities to quality journalism, again as reported by experts. Is it do they vary among countries? Are they the same? And we look at the implications of the digital transition for the role of direct government funding in media systems as a whole. And we come up with a set of judgments on whether direct government funding is used as an instrument of control, for example, in the broadcasting system. So there's a range of things that we bring. We are wedded to an approach which is explicitly normative. It's qualitative. It is based on a notion of national case studies which have integrity. There are all sorts of problems with this approach. We're aware of that, but that's what we're doing. And finally, we're very policy engaged. The point of these country reports is to provide civil society with resources and understanding in order to engage in the policy process. So, in terms of the Mapping Digital Media project, just to sum up, we don't really use the term media pluralism as an analytical concept or as even as one of our normative reference points. But just to come to just highlight really some of the issues that that Rachel and I identified. She'll be talking a bit more about the paper, and we would very much welcome your comments on the printed paper, which we will be publishing shortly. One of the key aspects of our paper is really finds that pluralism is not the most coherent policy objective. Looking back over the history of its development, we can see consistent commitment that it is an important thing. Media concentration is potentially threatening to democracy, but we see a lot of uncertainty in how to implement that in terms of rules, legal principles that are justiciable and not subject to endemic challenge. And we see a similar set of issues come up when we try and use it as a monitoring tool within the regulatory system. Huge number of methodological problems, even just within countries, comparing across different platforms. And there is a fundamental issue which is whether it's possible to come up with measures of media influence which will enable regulators to take decisions to approve or not approve mergers, or to say on the basis of endogenous growth that an unacceptable degree of media concentration has taken place, particularly if they have also to take into account internal pluralism and a range of other things, multi-sourcing, exposure diversity, and so forth. So in order to raise some debate, I'm proposing that whilst, because of obvious path dependencies, not least the name of the centre that is kindly hosting us today, and the existing legal and policy framework, media pluralism is a word that we are, in a sense, stuck with. But the question I would pose is, what does it do for us? And wouldn't we be better with direct measures of all those things that it's a proxy for? For example, concentration. For example, internal diversity. Separately, do we need an additional measure? Just a question. Do we need the additional concept?
I think that this question is a very good question. So we have really few minutes if there are comments on Damien. I don't want to react, but
just give a
yes.
short reaction. Damien, if I may just provide a short comment on your last remark. Do we need an additional, what was it exactly that you used in terms of, do we need an additional level or?
The question I'm posing, and I'm trying to be provocative, is the word pluralism itself.
Yes.
What does it add to the things?
It's an easy way to group a number of issues that are important for
where does the group
role of the media in democratic formation and cultural development and everything that we expect from the media. You can, and actually that's what we do in the Monitor, we look at these issues separately and we don't come up with like a golden figure in the end that combines everything. And I agree with you that it's probably not desirable to do so, because what would it learn? It's what we want to know is how diverse are the political views in the media, how diverse are the cultural, or how the cultural groups represented in the media. That's what we.
So it is not an objective. In itself. It's a label for a bundle of discrete
objectives.
Yes,
I think so. Yes, I think.
Which themselves, the theory is that they are the ingredients of a healthy democratic media, and those ingredients are the same in a number of different kinds of countries and political systems.
Yes.
A couple of years ago, I had to design a legal database. And with regard to this, of course, you need to come up with a classification system if you want to present some topics and people have an easier way to navigate. And precisely there came up the question whether pluralism and media concentration is actually the same. Now, I can report to you that I decided it was not the same in our context. And indeed, when we then later had to group articles that would fit one or the other category, we had amazingly little problem to say, this is this and this is that. It's not that they don't talk to each other, but at least when you look at the legal framework, what is done normally under the heading media concentration is quite different from what is done under the heading media pluralism. Now, media concentration has an impact on media pluralism, but I would hesitate to really make them the same or say one is on top of the other or includes the other one. I would not be able to sustain that indeed, and in the conversation we had that often, I mean, media concentration as one of the indicators makes it more likely that you end up with a pluralistic result. I'm not even sure about that anymore, because when I look, let me give you the example of German public service broadcasters. You have lots of them, and when you, because of the Länder situation, and it happens that at certain hours, when you sub through the channels, they all have talk shows. Now, if one public service media broadcaster had all these channels, you would end up with a more pluralistic content. So, just to give you one more example why at the time, I I joined you and I separated them.
Damian, I think that we are obliged to use pluralism because Norberto Bobbio would say it's a dimension of democracy. So we have to deal with democracy.
But I'm speaking also in policy terms as a
policy
objective and as a set of legal rules. In the UK legislation, there is a media mergers test, which we discuss in the paper, and ministers have to take a view on whether the merger is likely to result in a substantial threat to media pluralism. Rachel will know the wording better than I do. Substantial.
Whether there's a sufficient, it depends, there are a number of different tests, and one of them, whether there's a sufficient diversity and plurality in owners providing content to particular audiences, so it's...
Yeah, but let me ask you, because you raised a very important, your initial provocation, campaign tool, policy issue, monitoring tool. Why don't, I mean, I like your typology, but don't you think that at the end they can be combined together?
Well, I mentioned I have the same. I think that there is a research task, which is to actually do the archaeological work of where all this comes from and how we got where we are. I think my instinct is that bad things happen when you move from one to the other, and that policymakers are asked by politicians to achieve certain objectives, and people drafting laws find themselves in trying to implement something like this sufficient plurality of persons, and question mark. I haven't made up my mind, but my sense is that there are problems, and I think at least at the level of if we're having a kind of a conceptual discussion here, and I think that was the point of the session. I think we need to make that distinction between these different levels.
Well, I think that anymore. Oh, sure.
Yes, just very, very briefly. I mean, I don't necessarily see them as being in antagonism, because I think your categories are interesting, and I think, forgive me if I'm wrong, but I think the Media Pluralism Monitor is in part a tool to enable people to understand failings in their system that then might need a regulatory response in some way. It's diagnostic in the sense that you suggested. And of course that then leads to the more critical and more contextual analysis that may help one to understand a little bit more the kind of interventions that would actually work. So I can see that these two systems actually speak to each other and actually can enrich each other rather than necessarily being in opposition. The mistake is to think that you can just read off, perhaps from a particular failure in a particular field, a particular response, that a structural response will respond to that without being aware of the broader context.
Yeah.
And there's also another difficulty, which is doing a comparative study and coming up with some conceptual classifications and risk indicators, which I think is a hugely valuable and useful exercise, is quite different to a set of thresholds and diagnoses within a regulatory system. So take the example of the public interest test report that Ofcom conducted in December 2010 in relation to the News Corporation's bid for the remaining 60% or so of Sky it didn't already own. That, if the merger had been approved, that would have been shot to pieces. There would have been challenge, there would have been judicial review, if that was seen as the evidence that the minister was basing his decision on, to refer to the Competition Commission. And then if the Competition Commission then referred to that evidence, again, you have, where you don't have clear objective measures and you have ill-defined objectives, you have constant challenge. So all the rest of the media sector, in my view, would have been quite likely to challenge that kind of decision. So there is a distinction between a monitoring tool and something which is robust and justiciable for that simple reason. If it's within if it's supposed to be basing decisions upon that research, which have such a huge import, it's going to be subject to challenge, and the standards are different. You know, equally, we don't apply the same epistemological standards to campaign slogans as we do to analytical frameworks or monitoring. So.
Well, yes, I think we have to stop. Anyway, we'll continue discussion at dinner if somebody wants, but anyway, certainly tomorrow. Let me say only that if we have to take out pluralism.